Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today I'm joined by Clara. Clara is from Italy and she really likes languages, learning languages, and she's a bit of a polyglot. I don't know, how many languages do you speak right now, Clara?
Currently counting my native language, I think 7. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, if I can count right.
Oh, that's very impressive. And yeah, besides languages, Clara is also into personal knowledge management apps. She works for Rome Research. So welcome, Clara.
Thank you, Don, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, great. Great to have you here. So yeah, let's talk a bit about how you got into language learning, like why you're so interested in it and how did you become so proficient in it?
Oh, yeah. So basically, it's kind of like a life commitment pretty much because I started with English. So my native language is Italian. And when I was like super little, my parents used to put like English cartoons of like VHSs and stuff like that when there was still VHSs at the time. And so they really wanted me to learn languages and they encouraged me to like learn about other cultures and yeah, expand my knowledge in that sense. Because both of my parents, even though they don't really speak foreign languages, they've always been fascinated by that. So they kind of instilled that into me. And that's how I started. And then both academically as well as in my free time, I've always been engaging with foreign languages because I did a foreign language based high school here in Italy, and then a foreign language degree at university. So that's how I did that academically. So, like the very traditional learning path. But then at the same time, I've also been very interested in sort of self-learning and doing that with foreign languages, of course.
Right. So what was the first foreign language? I guess English, you mentioned as a child. And
English.
What was the next one?
Yes. Next one was, I think, French in middle school. I haven't really gotten back to French, but that was like chronologically speaking the second language. Then in high school, I did German, Russian, as well as continuing with English. Then at university, I took up Portuguese and Japanese. And then after that, I did, so the first language I really did like on my own was Korean, as well as Spanish.
Right.
So that was the one. And now I'm learning Dutch.
Right.
So
nice.
Kind of like the path.
Yeah. Nice. So yeah, you mentioned like both academic learning and then self-learning. Can you talk a bit more about that? Like what is the academic approach? What is your own approach and how do they differ?
Yeah. So when I first started, of course, I don't know about other countries, but in Italy, it's very grammar focused.
Right.
So you really drill a lot of grammar and you hardly speak. Like there's barely any speaking and barely any listening. So it's mostly reading, lots of reading, comprehension of texts. Also, because I did a lot of literature at the time as well.
Right.
So that kind of tied into that. And then just lots and lots of grammar. The thing that they used to do as well in high school as well as universities, they would make you do sort of the European framework tests, so the A1, A2, etc. So that was a huge thing as well back in the day when I was attending university in high school. I remember doing a bunch of those tests for all those languages. So it was a type of learning that was more focused into kind of passing tests.
Yeah.
And not really actually being able to use the language with people. Because I remember a lot of my classmates at the time, they could understand the language, fairly well, not too well. But then when it came to either listening comprehension or speaking, they would just get lost. So that was one thing that I noticed at the time. And then after my academic type of learning, then I went on to learn languages by myself. And I just got stuck because I was using that same method. But for Korean, for example, I would just do a bunch of grammar lessons and I just couldn't understand if I watched, YouTube video in Korean or I had to speak to Koreans for work. So then it got me thinking that the only language that I was fluent in at the time was English. And so I started thinking, oh, what it is that it's different that I'm doing in English versus what I'm doing for the other languages. And the answer for me was that I was consuming a lot of content in English,
Yeah.
both written content and audio, video, etc. And I wasn't doing that in other languages. And that was the sort of like start of the rabbit hole in comprehensible input and all the hypotheses from Stephen Krashen.
Right.
So that's what I went into. Then I started researching a little bit more. And then I started focusing, I changed my approach for Korean at that time. So I focused a lot more on reading lots and lots of content for natives in Korean, as well as listening, watching lots of shows, etc. So, and in a year and a half, I got to an intermediate level in Korean. I was also using it every day for work.
Yeah.
So that was pretty surprising. So from then on, I started just trusting input-based methods. And yeah, that's how for me it's different. When it comes to an academic approach, it's much more formal, and it's a really grammar based. So you kind of get drilled and drilled and drilled and tested and tested and tested. Whereas a more self-learning type of method or more input-based method gives you a lot more freedom in the activities that you do, but it's more focused on you actually comprehending what it's being said by natives so that you can then actually speak and have meaningful conversations. I think the goal is different in those two approaches. The first one is more pass a test, and then the other one is to be able to use a language with people in real life situations.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think a lot of people are also a bit scared, maybe, or overwhelmed by the input hypothesis, because you watch something at first and you understand basically nothing, right? So what has been kind of your approach to get better at that or get comfortable with that? Like how do you handle that?
Great question. Yes. So there is that type of obstacle because we're not used, and this is what I think, we're not used to deal with the unknown and with confusion. Because if you think about how, school makes us learn, is it gives you like a very, a package of concepts then are then explained to you, and everything is very easy to understand. And there is like a set curriculum. So everything is very predictable and you always know where you are in a sort of, path. Whereas when it comes to learning a language with input-based methods, you sort of gain so much freedom because you can choose pretty much anything you want to do. But that also comes with a feeling of confusion. Like, for example, and this is a very recent memory, when I started learning Dutch 2 or 3 months ago, I started watching YouTube videos. I was like, I don't understand anything. And then 3 months later, I can actually get, the main topic of a conversation. Maybe I don't get all the words, but I get what is being said and the general ideas. But I'm able to do that now because I accepted and embraced the confusion and the what the hell is this type of phase. It's just something that you kind of need to go through. But the difference, I think, is just that it's very steep in difficulty when you use this type of approach. Like you start with like a wall basically, and you have to climb that wall first, and then it goes downhill and it gets really easy the more you do it. Whereas a typical approach, maybe an academic approach or a grammar-based approach, is the opposite. It starts very easy, but then at some point it gets really hard, and that what a lot of people call the intermediate plateau, they just get stuck in that phase. But that, I think, it's a consequence of this type of approach. So my just recommendation is just to embrace that phase in which you're super confused and not think about it, and just keep on consuming content, keep on reading, keep on listening, and it'll get easier eventually.
Yeah, I think it's just something we have to overcome. And yeah, very interesting, of course, that you're learning Dutch, which is my native language. Yeah, when you started that, do you feel like at this point you kind of have a repeatable process for approaching a language, or is it still new every time? Like, how did you approach that compared to previous languages?
Yeah. So now the Dutch is the third language that I'm learning with this method. And I think, yes, I do have sort of guidelines that are very general, but then of course everything changes language to language because of course the content is different. It can be easier, harder to find content that you can listen to or read, right?
Yeah.
So, but now I think what I generally do when I start, I personally use Link, Lingq, for sort of breaking into a language because they have sets of mini stories where they introduce you to sort of like the main syntax structure of a language and the main vocabulary, the most common vocabulary, and it's repeated a lot of times. So it's kind of sort of like a natural spaced repetition system
Right.
that you just listen and read these stories. So that's kind of what I do at first. I just get very easy stories and read and listen to them. Then what I do next, or in conjunction, depending on how I feel like it, when it comes to reading, I start reading books that I've already read in other languages, and I just switch to my target language.
Right.
And it's usually books that of stuff that I like to read about. So it makes it more fun for me, but I also have all the context. And I can use basically the book, for example, in English, as a sort of dictionary for the same book that I'm reading, this example in Dutch. So what I do is I have like on my iPad, I keep the same book, like the same page of the book in split view. And I read the Dutch version. And then if I get stuck, then I can check the English one. And that's how I go with reading. And that's what I do for vocabulary acquisition. I just read a lot. And then for listening, I first start with YouTube videos just because they're easier to understand for me. They're shorter. Vlogs, for example, like just people doing their daily life stuff. So it's kind of easier for me to break into the spoken language like that.
Yeah.
And then once I get more confident, then I might start watching TV series or movies made in that language. So it's not stuff that is dubbed. It's just stuff for natives. And I watch that. But that only comes maybe, I don't know, a year after I started learning, I've noticed. It's not immediate because it gets really hard really fast.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, definitely. So then when you listen to stuff or when you read stuff, so some
yeah.
people recommend like also to do spaced repetition, that you do like this sentence mining, right? Where you take out a sentence and
Yeah.
put certain words on flashcards. Like, do you do that at all? Or do you just trust that when you read or listen enough, you will hear and see the same words often enough that you will remember them?
Yeah, I do the second option. I don't use spaced repetition. The reason is very simple. I just don't find it like a fun activity for me. And so I prioritize fun over anything else, over efficiency, over everything. So for me, if an activity is not fun, it's not going to stick. I will not be able to make it a habit. So that's why I don't do it. But I've noticed that if I replace spaced repetition, like the time I would spend with spaced repetition, into more reading, then I still get the words that I need. Plus, I get exposed to the same words, but in different contexts. So that actually helps me kind of like reframe the meaning of a single word the more times I encounter it. And, the more different the contexts are, then I'll slowly start to get like a more 360 view of a single word or a type of sentence that is being repeated. And also one thing in books, especially in books that are translated into a language, I've noticed over time that certain translators always come back to the same set of words to describe things. So actually, that's a great exercise in spaced repetition without using a software or an algorithm. You just read, and you'll notice over time that there's a certain set of words that is always being used. So you get to learn that and memorize it very quickly, actually. For listening, yeah, I just, again, massive amounts of listening. And I don't speak from day one. Actually, I haven't still spoken Dutch. Yeah, I don't do it because I really need to get the sound down from listening first. And then once I get familiar with those sounds enough, I'll feel it inside of me, sort of like an urge to speak. And until I don't have that urge to speak, I will just shut up and listen and keep reading. But that also helps me not to ingrain like wrong pronunciation habits as well, because I'm not speaking from day one. So depending on the language, though, of course, there are certain languages that have a set of sounds that are more familiar to me, other languages that might have a completely different set of sounds. So that, of course, plays into that as well.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess there are different approaches. I like to speak from day one, but yeah, there's a lot of people also recommending not doing that. So then once you do start speaking, do you just speak at every possible opportunity, or do you also pick like a language partner that you frequently meet up with and talk with?
That is a great question, because I've tried a huge number of like like speaking partner apps and everything, and I couldn't find people who were actually interested in language exchanges, or that, like you could actually become friends over time, because I think that's a huge thing.
Yeah.
One reason for me, and again, this comes back to maybe the goal of learning a language in the first place, is that I have people I want to talk to in that language. So I don't really have that problem, because when I started learning Korean, I had a bunch of Korean friends where I lived. So it was very easy for me to then start speaking and have meaningful conversations. If I don't have those people in my life, then it gets very hard, to be honest. So I'm not sure exactly on like a method of like how to find people in your target language, because it never worked for me. So it's just like going through life and finding people from different countries and different cultures, and then develop friendships with them. And then I start learning the language. That's usually the pattern that I have.
Right. Yeah, actually, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I guess in my case, like, it just was the case that I first met the people and then decided to learn the language. So I already had the people, right? So
exactly. Because I wouldn't really have, like, people are a huge motivator for me to learn languages. I wouldn't really have a reason to learn another language if it wasn't for somebody that I had in my life that I wanted to be close to, both in friendships or like in relationships as well. So, and I've also noticed a lot of people as well, like they either have like a partner who's from another country, or friends or from different countries, and that's kind of their main motivator. Yeah, otherwise I don't think I would be learning a language, maybe. I don't know.
Then, let's talk a bit about apps and tools and stuff. Because, you mentioned Link in language acquisition. You're also working for Rome Research, which is another like a personal knowledge management tool. So, can you talk a bit about which apps do you learn in language acquisition? And then maybe more broadly, which other apps do you use to learn or to basically manage your...
Yeah, so the app I've used the most in time as well is Link. In general, I don't have like specific apps like Duolingo, etc. that a lot of people use. I tend not to use that just because I don't find them useful for the type of learning that I do. Whenever I learn a language, I just want something in which it's easy for me to save words and then encounter them again, and an environment that is like easy for me to import either articles or subtitles from movies, etc. So for me, what I need is to have like an environment that allows me to put books content, just content basically, and then use it to save words. And LingQ is just perfect for that use case. So that's what I use. I've tried using Roam as well, same way, but it's still like I would need to create some plugins to make it a little more automated because it's very, very, very manual right now. But yeah, so I just use those two apps really. I've used other apps in the past, like I've dabbled a little bit with Duolingo and apps of the like. There's tons of apps to do that type of things, but yeah, I don't really use them. I just need something that allows me to import content and work on it, saving words, saving phrases, highlighting stuff. That's kind of the main thing that I do. You could do it, I was thinking you could do it manually, as in like you have a PDF of a book and you just highlight, words,
Right.
and then you look them up and you write the meaning on top of it. Basically, that's what I do, but in, a digital way, which makes it easier because I have easy access to dictionaries, etc. So that's kind of what I do in terms of what I save. I'm not super into like stats, for example. So I don't really have a way to track how many words I'm saving. Well, LingQ does it automatically, but I don't look at those stats. But if I were doing it in Roam, I wouldn't really be interested in knowing that necessarily, because the way I kind of understand my own progress is just getting the same content that I was listening 1 or 2 months ago and seeing how much more I can understand that. And then kind of I can figure out how much I've progressed from that. So it's very easy actually. You could do this method on any program that allows you to work with texts and create links between texts and create pages, etc. So as long as you have that, you can actually do this more manually or not, depends on the program itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's also what we've been trying to do with Traverse, with the templates. I don't know if you had a look at that one.
Yeah, I really like how customizable it is as well. For example, I've checked out the language learning template. So for example, I don't use flashcards, right? In the roadmap, there is, focus on flashcards, but since it's customizable, I can just decide to swap it for a different activity, for example. But I like the template, and I like how it's, kind of an adventure of sorts. Like
Right.
you start, by knowing nothing, and then I like how you can go back and forth within the template, so you can actually see how much you've progressed as well. So I find it great, and it's definitely something to check out, especially I'm not into SRS, but someone who's really into SRS, I think, would find Traverse really, really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk a bit also about, obviously you're quite into Roam as well. So you don't use it so much for language learning. So what kind of processes or learning or knowledge do you use Roam for, and how do you use it?
I use it. Okay, so one way I use it is to both at work in Roam.
Yeah, using Roam at Roam.
But also within Roam itself. So it's kind of an inception thingy. But yeah, so I log my work. So I use it in one way as a logbook.
Right.
So because of the daily notes pages as well, you just start up Roam, you start with your day. So it kind of, it's easy for me to use as like a interstitial journaling technique as well. So I do that for work, but I also do that for, my private life as well. I like to track sort of how much time I spend doing a certain activity, but I also use Roam for learning. So for example, now I'm learning JavaScript, and I have several resources. So what I'm doing right now, I'm kind of experimenting with importing books or resources into a Roam graph, and then learning from those directly in there, And then once I'm done, and once I think I have a good understanding of, in this case, JavaScript, then I can reuse those blocks to create sort of like a curriculum if I had to teach JavaScript to a teammate of mine who wanted to do it, for example. So, and preparing different types of curriculums based on how much time my teammate has to learn it versus how much time I've had. So giving basically different roadmaps for learning within Rome. So transforming your inputs into outputs that you can then give to other people. The first use case I had for Rome when I started using it before I started working in Rome is that I was making videos on a YouTube channel about language learning. And I had lots of books that I was reading about several types of topics, but they would help me get ideas for videos or would be the base of research for other videos. And I wanted to have a way to connect where those ideas came from with my own outputs. And Rome was the perfect place to do that. So that was my first use case as well. So I mainly use it, yes, for learning, but then also applying what I'm learning into content, which could be articles or videos, etc., or helping somebody else learn what I've learned, for example.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting actually that you're learning JavaScript. Like, obviously, like it's a programming language. Is it like your first programming language? And how do you find learning programming languages? How does it differ from learning like actual spoken languages? I think that would be an interesting question.
Yeah, it is. It's a great question. I've been into web development, but for a while, I've gotten to, I would say, a decent level of CSS. Also because like working in Rome, of course, you can use CSS within Rome to change, the layout and the aspects of your graph. So at some point I had this like urge to change some things. And I was like, how can I do it? And people were like, yeah, you can use CSS. And then I went into the rabbit hole. And, that's how it goes. And same thing for JavaScript. The main goal for me is to like create plugins for Rome that can help with language learning, for example, or just the small little problems that I have with the things that I do, and sort of like having the power to just create something that solves a problem, I find it really interesting. So that's why I was drawn to it. As far as programming languages go, it's my first programming language. I've been debating whether I wanted to start with Clojure or JavaScript. So I've been thinking about it because, of course, at Rome, like we use Clojure. So learning any of those would be good for my job as well. So, but I figured I was just going to start with JavaScript.
Yeah,
and then,
if you ask me, you made the right choice.
But yeah, so that's how it started. And one thing I've noticed is, actually, when you compare it to natural languages, right? I'm a huge syntax nerd. I love syntax in languages, in natural languages. I just love seeing how a language, puts words together to convey a message versus another language. And that really helps me with programming as well, because whenever I read a piece of code, what my brain does automatically is it starts, I see this keyword, it does this thing. And then together with this function, it does this other thing. And then it creates this value. And I noticed that is exactly the same thing I used to do when I was learning languages more formally in university. I was always like trying to deconstruct sentences and understanding that. And I think there's a lot of overlap between what you do in linguistics, for example, these types of exercises, and what you do when you learn a programming language. You kind of have the building blocks, but at the same time, you want to be able to grab a piece of code and being able to deconstruct it and understand what each piece does and how it all ties together. So I think that's a great exercise that if you do that, if you're used to doing it with natural languages, then you can port it very easily to learn programming languages as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comparison. So yeah, I guess one question I always ask is like in all this learning journey, basically, what has been the biggest challenge that you faced and how did you overcome it?
Okay, so I'm a very introverted person. So for me, when it comes to learning, the hardest bit is to either share it with others, or when it comes to language learning, like actually speaking to people.
Right.
Like I always had lots of anxiety from that. Also, one thing is like, of course, I'm a perfectionist, so I want to be able to speak perfectly, which is not
No.
possible. Like I don't speak perfectly in Italian, so why would I think I could speak perfectly in other languages, right? But that's a sort of unreal expectation I always have towards myself. So that's the biggest challenge, is like overcoming my own anxiety. But language learning has been a huge help with that, because I was forced to speak in other languages. But at the same time, I noticed with myself, I am way less shy if I speak in foreign languages, maybe because I don't have that emotional connection. Whereas if I would do it in my native language, I would get a lot more anxious. So it's been therapeutic.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've noticed that as well. Like less hesitation. Like you don't care as much, I guess, what people think.
Right? Exactly. And probably you don't. I think it's a different headspace as well that you have when you're speaking in another language. You have way less social cues that you're thinking about because you're focused in speaking on another language. So I think you're less, aware of all the other things that are going on, and you're kind of more focused on getting your message across. So that could help if you're an introverted person like me.
Yeah, that's actually interesting that you mentioned headspace, because some people say that you can think in a language. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know about myself, but do you think in different languages as well?
That's tricky because when I talk to myself, for example, I do talk to myself in English a lot. Also because I think it's because I work in English and my personal life with my, my relationships and my friendships, I use English way more than I use Italian. So I guess I could say that I can think in English, but I wouldn't really know. What I do know though is, and it might be correlated, but the thing when people say that you have a different personality when you speak a different language? That is, for me, it's true. Like, I am a different person in Italian, I'm a different person in English, and a different person in Russian and Japanese, etc. I remember when I used to work in Florence before, my coworkers used to make fun of me because I would have like customers from different countries and I would switch personality depending on the language, and they would always make fun of me because of that. So yeah, I'm not sure how, when it comes to like thinking or even dreaming, there's some people who say, oh, I dream in a certain language. I don't know how much of that is true for me, but I definitely noticed that there is a behavioral change. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's true as well. Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of interesting stuff in this interview. So one thing I also asked at the end is like, who do you suggest that I should interview next?
Ooh, I'll need to think about it. But one person I think you should interview is actually one of my teammates, Matt.
Okay.
Who has lots and lots of great ideas. And he's actually the person who started the Rome Book Club. So he has lots of interesting things to talk about in that sense as well, how to, learn from books as well as running communities around books. So he might be a great person to talk to.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll get in touch with him. And then, yeah,
Nice.
finally, if people want to find out more about you or follow you, what's the best way for them to find you?
So I would guess for now, Twitter at the Indlang, INDLANG.
Hmm.
That's my Twitter handle. That's the best way. But I'm also not super active on any social media, to be honest. So, but yeah, if you really want to talk to me, I guess that's the best place.
All right. Awesome.
All right.
Cool. Thanks a lot for this interview, Clara.
Thank you, Dom, for having me. It was great fun.
Bye.